Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Friday, July the 14th, 2023. Long-time viewers, listeners to the Keen On show know that in the old days, we always used to ask authors what their favorite books were. And one book that came up time and time again was a novel called HAMNET by Maggie O'Farrell, a book about Shakespeare's son, or an imaginary Shakespeare's son, a novel, huge success. When you go to Amazon, has 54,000 ratings. It's astonishing. Most books don't even get 54 ratings, let alone 54,000. It's won all sorts of awards. And I'm really honored and thrilled that Maggie O'Farrell, who has followed up her prize-winning HAMNET with another huge success, The Marriage Portrait. It came out last year in hardback, and it's out right now in paperback. It's got 18,000 reviews on Amazon, which isn't bad. And I'm absolutely thrilled and honored that Maggie O'Farrell is joining us from Edinburgh, Scotland, where she lives. Maggie, congratulations on the paperback. I'm sure you always get this question on the relationship between HAMNET and The Marriage Portrait, but they're both books about, or they're both novels about imaginary children. Is that fair?
Well, they are novels, but certainly Lucrezia in The Marriage Portrait and HAMNET in HAMNET were definitely not imaginary. They were both real, and they lived about 500 years ago. They are separated by about 30 years in time. But actually, I think when I started writing The Marriage Portrait, I was hoping that I remember hoping that some of the research I'd done for HAMNET might mean that I had less homework to do for writing The Marriage Portrait. But actually, the life of an 11-year-old boy in rural England in the late 16th century is miles apart and years apart. It's a totally different world to Lucrezia, who was a Renaissance principessa in 16th century Florence. So actually, I had to unlearn everything I'd learned about rural England in the 16th century and learn everything about Florence in the Renaissance.
Do you have any kids of your own?
I do. I have 3 kids. Yeah, my eldest is 20 and my youngest is 11.
Wow, so you're on the front lines of what it's like to be a parent. There's this, I guess it's a truism about modernity, that we invented the idea of childhood. In The Marriage Portrait, this young girl is presented both as a child and as an adult. Was there such a thing, Maggie, as childhood in the 16th century, the area that you've written so successfully about?
I think absolutely. I don't really subscribe to the belief that we've invented childhood. I think childhood exists, in its own right. It exists because there are children in the world. And certainly, yes, Lucrezia was born into a life of enormous wealth and privilege. She was a Medici, which is one of the most famous and the most powerful dynasties of that time. But and at the same time, she lived in a palazzo, a Renaissance palazzo in Florence. But she essentially spent her whole life in lockdown. It was too dangerous for her and her siblings to leave the palazzo because her father, Cosimo de' Medici, was so worried about assassination attempts on or kidnapping of his children, because these were very, very precious and heirs to the Medici dynasty. So I think her childhood was certainly one of limitations, enormous privilege, but huge limitations. She and her siblings essentially lived in sort of 2 rooms of this vast palazzo. If they wanted to exercise or fresh air, they had to walk out on the battlements. But at the same time, having said that I do think childhood existed. Yes, she was betrothed at the age of 13 which, you know, we would count into modern day world as.
Yeah, and she wasn't exactly thrilled with that. That's the central narrative.
I don't think so. I mean, actually, yes. So if you were a son born into the time and place, if you were, you know, born into a family like the Medici's in 16th century Italy, the expectation was that you'd become a ruler and a soldier like your father. And if you were a daughter, the expectation was that you would make a politically advantageous marriage. You know, you would have an arranged marriage that was, for some reason, sort of politically or fiscally advantageous for your region and your parents. And that's exactly what happened to Lucrezia. So she was betrothed at 13. She began her marriage at 15 to a man almost twice her age, and then by 16 she was dead.
One of the things I didn't, and excuse the dim-wittedness of this question, one of the things that I didn't quite understand about the book was, why was that a big deal? I always assumed that older men, I mean, the husband was only in his late 20s. What was the big deal about a man in his late 20s marrying a teenager, especially in an arranged marriage? Was that unusual, Maggie?
I don't think it was that unusual. I mean, actually, Lucrezia's parents were only about, I think Cosimo was maybe 2-3 years older than Lucrezia's mother. But it wasn't unusual for a young girl of 15, unfortunately, to be married to a man of 27. So I think that was, you know, Alfonso.
Why do you say unfortunately?
Unfortunately, well, because she's 15, which I think is pretty unpalatable to be paired off with a man who's 27. You know, to me that's very unfortunate and very unpalatable. And actually,
even for a 17, I mean, even if the husband was 17, 15 is pretty young, isn't it?
No, I mean, today's world is it's illegal, you know, for good reason.
The book then, and the character is this odd mix in my mind of incredible sophistication, a kind of a 16th century mind with innocence. What kind of woman? I mean, obviously it's a fictional recreation, but what kind of woman do you think Lucrezia de Medici was? Or could we even call her a woman? I mean, a girl, I guess.
Yeah, I would call her a girl. I mean, she died at 16. To me, that's still a girl, not quite a woman, is it? On the cusp of. I mean, actually, to be honest, the real Lucrezia de Medici has not left many marks or impressions.
We don't want you to be too honest, Maggie. You're a novelist.
She hasn't left too many traces of herself in the historical records. You know, despite being born into a very famous dynasty and marrying into another one, she herself has pretty much gone under the radar. Her parents, Cosimo and Eleonora, despite having had an arranged marriage, were very devoted to each other, and they wrote to each other a lot. And the letters are, you know, a real cache of domestic detail of the Medicis. But actually, Lucrezia barely gets a mention. It's very clear from the letters that Cosimo, the dad, really favors Isabella, one of the other sisters, and the mother, Eleonora, favors the sons. Lucrezia gets, I think, 1 or 2 mentions. There's one mention of her being unwell with a stomach problem, and there's another one of her not concentrating in her lessons that mentions that she's a bit of a daydreamer. And actually, that's pretty much it. I mean, obviously, her life was very short. You know, she died at the age of 16.
Yeah.
But really, you know, she is somebody whose life has been written in water.
And she is best known because of Robert Browning's poem, My Last Duchess. Was that your introduction to her? Is that what inspired you to, at least at the beginning, to think about writing a novel about her?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's how I came to her, really, you know, because I love that poem. I studied it at school, and I was I often reread Robert Browning's dramatic monologues, especially when I'm between novels, because they are just so perfect and so brilliant. And I was rereading it one day. Just actually, it was in February 2020, because you know, we all remember what we were doing then. And I was just wondering to myself idly one day whether or not it was based on real people. It's an incredibly powerful poem. It features an Italian duke describing to a visitor his previous wife, and he shows him a portrait, and he says, you know, isn't she beautiful? She kind of annoyed me sometimes. And also, I murdered her, by the way. He's also talking to the representative of the woman, the family of the woman he's now hoping to marry, which is quite an extraordinary admission to somebody, you know, confessing or not, you know, but actually being quite proud of the fact that he murdered this young girl. So I started looking. I was just wondering if it was based on real people. So I started looking, and I found pretty quickly her name, Lucrezia de Medici, and that she'd been 16 when she died. And also this portrait, which the only one of her in existence, which was painted by Agnolo Bronzino, who painted most of the rest of the family. He was obviously a very favoured court portrait artist, and he painted her. And as soon as I looked at this portrait, I just knew it was a kind of like a weird lightning strike. I knew that I would write a novel about her. I would want to write her story that she might have told were she able.
You're a mother, 3 children, so you know we're not supposed to favoritize our kids, Maggie. The book, in a way, is about a father who favoritized one daughter over another, and the emotions of the daughter who survived. What about as a writer? I mean, when you have this ridiculous success of a book like HAMNET, you've written many other books, many other very well-reviewed, successful books. Do you sometimes think of books like children? Are you supposed to be fair to all of them as a writer?
I'm not trying to think of them as children. And actually, I genuinely don't have a favourite of my books. It would be a kind of a strange... It would be a strange thing to think about.
You're a good parent. You're a good parent.
I mean, I couldn't possibly favour any of my children above the others. I love them all to a ridiculous degree. I think they're the 3 most perfect human beings ever known.
That's what you tell them, at least. Right?
That is true. It's absolutely true. I confess that. And books, in a sense, I think they're all...
Here are all your books. I mean, you've got a ridiculous amount of books.
I think they all represent certain phases in my life and certain interests, and they had their own joys and challenges, just like children, I suppose, in a way. So no, I genuinely, hand on heart, don't have one that I love more than the others.
A lot of the reviews of the marriage portrait, Maggie, have focused on the fact that, for better or worse, you're what the Guardian or what one reviewer suggested, suiting modern sensibilities. Some of the reviewers like that, some are a little bit more ambivalent. Did you make an effort to suit modern sensibilities? Should novelists recreating imaginary or semi-imaginary historical figures, should they be in the business of creating these people to suit modern sensibilities?
Well, I think in a sense, writing any historical novel, it is going to be a view on the past, which is written in the present. That's what historical novels are. If you look at something like Middlemarch is a historical novel, and the very kind of form itself is about the modern world looking back at this past world, wherever that might be, 50 years ago, 500 years ago. So in a way, that's inevitable, and obviously this is a novel. I chose not to write a biography or a historical novel about Lucrezia or about her family. I think obviously, the kind of lack of historical record about Lucrezia might be a frustration to a biographer, but to a novelist, it's an opportunity. So you are going to fill in those gaps with whatever narrative you yourself want to tell. But I think, a modern viewpoint on the past is essentially what a historical novel is.
So you don't think that a novelist should fight those modern sensibilities?
Well, it's not so much that. I think if you are going to choose to write about the past, and particularly write about people who were real, even though they've been dead for centuries, you do have a responsibility to get it as right as you possibly can. But I suppose I do believe at my very core that although the world changes all the time, Lucrezia's world is vanished. It's gone. She would find our world totally baffling and alien. So I think the world changes all the time. But I do really strongly believe that I don't think human hearts and minds do change that much. I think humans are essentially the same. There is a kind of commonality between us and them. I don't believe that the past is an alien, different country that's unrecognizable to us. I think actually, you might walk through the Uffizi Gallery in Florence and see these marriage portraits of these young girls. And I mean girls, not women, because they were girls. And they might look meek and accepting and submissive to the idea that they are making these, essentially political merger marriages. But I don't think they were. I think they can't possibly have been, and you just have to think about what a teenager is like. Meek and submissive and accepting are not adjectives which I I would attach to teenagers. I can't even get my teenage daughter to wear a coat when it rains. You know, the idea of having
Well,
to
Maggie, I have a daughter in her early 20s, and nothing's going to change. It only gets worse, I guarantee you.
Thanks, Andrew. That's that's very encouraging. You know, so
Something to look forward to.
Thanks. So I don't necessarily think that some of those sensibilities are necessarily modern. I think that maybe they're human.
What is it, Maggie, about 16th century Italy that fascinates all of us? I'm sure you slipped in some research in Florence for this book. We all love going to Florence and that part of Italy. On the one hand, of course, the world of the Medicis is horrifying. It's Machiavellian in the worst sense. On the other hand, it produced all this art, these palaces, this remarkable culture. And we return to it time and time again. Beyond the beautiful art and buildings and palaces of Florence today, what is it about this world that is so important and attractive to us moderns?
I think part of it is, as you say, the beauty. I think the beauty of it is so astonishing, and you know, I think it's, and also, but I think something about it is that it's still very present in our world today, partly because of its enormous wealth. You know, men like Cosimo and from Tuscany and Alfonso from Ferrara. I mean, they were astronomically wealthy. You know, Lucrezia's dowry, the money that Cosimo gave to Alfonso when they married, was 200 gold scudi. And, you know, and I didn't know what that was, so I asked someone, and apparently it's the equivalent of $50 million in today's money, and that's the kind of amounts that were exchanging hands. But as you say, you know, none of that beauty and art and sculpture and painting was possible without the money that men like Alfonso and Cosimo had at their disposal. I mean, they were very ruthless rulers. They were both very successful and very, very ruthless. And, you know, in order to be successful and bring financial stability to your region, you had to be quite ruthless and brutal. There was an account that I read of Cosimo in a meeting with a foreign emissary. And, you know, by all accounts, he was a very loving man and father. He adored his wife, he adored his children. But when somebody annoyed him in this meeting, there's a description of him pulling a dagger from his boot, stabbing this guy mid-sentence, and then carrying on with the meeting. You know, that's what happened to you if you annoyed Cosimo. He was not going to put up with anyone who disagreed with him, put it that way. So I think, you know, what I came to see the Renaissance as is this kind of dichotomy of beauty and brutality. Yes, we have this astonishing architecture and sculpture and paintings that we all know today, even if we've never been lucky enough to go to Florence and see those paintings. We all know what Botticelli's Venus looks like. But it's also paired by this brutality, and you can't have one without the other.
There is, and I'm use this carefully, maybe you'll correct me, there is a kind of implicit feminism in the book, it seems to me. This is a woman who's looking for her own, a young woman or an older child who's looking for her own agency and questioning the fact that she is not able to choose who she marries and how she leads her life. Machiavelli, of course, famously wrote about fortune being a woman and riding her hard. Do you think of the book as a kind of, in a sense, a feminist story or a proto-feminist story?
Possibly. I mean, it's not something I set out to do, certainly. And, you know, I think the kind of engine behind the book for me was to want to tell her story. You know, the poem by Rob Browning is so famous, and I mean, rightly so, because it is beautiful and brilliant and chilling. But at the same time, I had this urge of wanting to take the curtain from the Duke's hand and say, that's enough, you know, and pull back that curtain and let her speak, you know, because I think actually what really interests me is particularly in writing historical novels, and this goes for Hamnet and also The Marriage Portrait, is it's not necessarily the people who are the history makers, the people who are rule, or the people who lead very famous or notorious lives that interest me. It's the people who are in the background, the ones that flit through the shadows are the ones that fascinate me, the ones that inspire me to write a book about them. You know, it's those people. And I suppose, you know, Agnes in Hamnet and also Lucrezia in The Marriage Portrait would be those people. So I suppose it's not a huge coincidence that they are women. But then again, you know, actually it was Hamnet, this lost and forgotten son who inspired me to write Hamnet. I've always felt that not enough people knew that Shakespeare had this son with pretty much the same name as possibly his most brilliant play. So in that way, but so I think it's not a huge coincidence that these people often tend to be women.
And is it a shriek from Maggie O'Farrell about how unjust the world was back then, or more of a book celebrating the agency of a girl who had no choices and yet wasn't willing really to accept that?
Well, what interested me while I was doing my research, actually, and this was, I wrote this book pretty much in lockdown. I got in touch with somebody, an art historian from Edinburgh University called Jill Burke, and she has this very brilliant lecture, which you can actually see online, which is about how she feels that the Renaissance could be seen as a time of the first wave of women and being professional writers and professional painters. There were a number of women working, supporting themselves and their family as painters and also writers at that time, which I found completely fascinating because it isn't something I knew about.
Yeah, we've done a couple of shows actually on books about female artists from that period.
Yeah, so that really interested me, but I suppose it was just, I think what spurred me on was this kind of untold idea, that she had been silenced and unnamed for so long. The only trace she left behind really is the portrait by Bronzino and also her unnamed and silent appearance in the poem. So I just wanted to tell her story because I think it had been hidden for so long.
As you mentioned, Bronzino produced this portrait. We don't know whether it was the real girl or otherwise. You've brought her back to life. The narrative of the book also includes the narrative of power and painting and representation. You've obviously given this a great deal of thought, but in terms of writers and painters and representation, what do you feel your responsibility is? Do you enjoy all that power, Maggie?
I'm not sure I would think of it as power, certainly. I mean, I think
it is. You decided who she should be in your book, for better or worse. I mean, you didn't put it out on Twitter and say, what should this woman look like?
Well, I think I think I used whatever I could find about her. I have a rule with myself that if you are going to choose to write about people who were real, even if they've been dead for a long time, it is your responsibility in a way to find out as much as you can. So I spent ages poring over this painting, which is by Bronzino, and also the other one, the copy of it, which is in the North Carolina Museum of Art, the Allure, which is the one I think that's been flashing up on the screen. So I spent ages poring over it with a magnifying glass to see if I could find every single detail, and looking at all the jewelry that she's wearing, and I realized that there's the belt that she's wearing, the cintura, the golden belt around her waist, is mentioned in a letter from Alfonso's father. He's a bit grumpy about getting it out of the safe to give to her. He doesn't want to hand it over to the Medicis, but he does, obviously, because she's wearing it. So I think you do have a responsibility, and I have a very strict rule that even if I found out a fact about her or her family that didn't quite fit with the narrative that I wanted to tell, that I still had to work hard to work it in. I couldn't just pretend I'd never read that. But I'm not sure if I see it as a kind of power. I think I see it as a responsibility. Even though I'm writing fiction, and this will be shelved in the fiction shelves in a bookshop, so obviously my Lucrezia isn't the real Lucrezia. I know that, and I hope readers know that as well. But I think what I would do is always feel a responsibility to get it as close as I possibly can.
Was the painter in the 16th century, in some ways, Maggie, the equivalent of the novelist of the 21st century? I mean, novels are modern things, and when the first one, what was 17th or 18th century, didn't become a popular form, whereas painting was much more popular. How do you compare and contrast the business of writing about someone versus painting them?
I think it's close, actually. That's an interesting idea, and I think I wanted the novel to to imitate as much as I could, in fact, the form of a sort of creation of a portrait. There's a whole theme in the novel about the underpainting, or the imprimatura, which is the layer of paint that an artist lays on a canvas or a piece, or a board, or a piece of tin, whatever it is they're painting on, and then they layer up the paint to create the painting. And I really loved that as a kind of metaphor for looking at history, because I just, you walk through a gallery like the Louvre or the Uffizi, and you see these beautiful, perfect paintings. And I love the idea that behind them are these other layers, these other interpretations. Art historians have X-rayed the Mona Lisa, which is probably the most famous painting ever, let alone a Renaissance painting. And they've discovered that behind her very famous smile are different iterations of a smile, of an expression that Da Vinci tried out before settling on the final one. And that, to me, is a very interesting metaphor for the way you can look at history. How we think we know one narrative, but actually behind it will be many other interpretations. But I think in Renaissance time, portraits had many purposes. They, in some ways, some of them were as a sense of showing off. Cosimo and Eleonora had themselves painted several times, many times actually, usually by Bronzino. And Eleonora's portraits, I have read that, that she was incredibly beautiful, Lucrezia's mother, very stunning looking. And she had, and she's wearing the most extraordinary, enormous, elaborate silk dresses. And I have read that some of these paintings were a kind of advertisement for the silk trade in Tuscany. So in one way, it's a kind of advertisement, but also, the betrothal portraits were a little bit like your online dating profile. When you take a selfie of yourself in the most flattering, in your best clothes, with all your hair and makeup done, and that's what they were. You got an artist to paint you in your best clothes, with all your jewelry and your hair looking gorgeous, and then you sent it to your prospective suitor to see whether or not he or she would fancy you.
When I think of the image of Lucrezia, and then I think of the work of so-called realist painters like Vermeer, Woman in Blue, for example, what happened to painting as it sort of drifted northwards from the Renaissance to the Reformation?
Well, I think all eras in art have their own motion and their own movement and interpretation. And I think we all stand on each other's shoulders, don't we? Without the Donatellos or the Botticellis of this world, there may not have been the Bronzinos. Without the Bronzinos, there may not have been the Vermeers. I think there is a kind of dialogue between eras in painting. And, that's true of all art forms, I think.
Finally, Maggie, I think a lot of people are going to be somewhat depressed that you spent your COVID years writing this book. Most people didn't quite know what to do with themselves. A lot of people are going to be watching and thinking to themselves, how can I be Maggie O'Farrell, at least replicate some of her writing success? What advice would you give wannabe historical novelists who want to, if not imitate your work, at least have some success, get more than 54 reviews on Amazon?
I think I don't know. I'm not sure I feel qualified really to give advice.
Well, you are, for better or worse, because you got 54,000 for HAMNET and even 18,000 for Marriage Portrait. So readers love you, Maggie, and reviewers love you. So you have it's a fair question.
I think what I would say, I think the best piece of advice I could probably give is that if you want to write, you have to be very fierce about ring fencing your time to write. I think
you have to be tigerish, right?
You have to be tigerish, exactly.
There's a tiger in the Marriage Portrait. So.
That's right. There is a very important tiger in the Marriage Portrait. Cosimo kept exotic animals in the basement of his palazzo because why not? But I think say to yourself, I'm going to write. After you send the kids to school, or whatever it is, you decide you're going to start at 9 a.m. and you're going to sit there till 10 a.m. and nothing is going to distract you. So you turn off your email, you turn off your phone, and you focus exactly on that. And you might not write anything. You might write a paragraph, you might write a sentence, but make sure you stick to that and be really fierce about it. Don't let anything encroach on your writing time, and something will come.
Be a tiger. How long did the Marriage Portrait take you from beginning to end, from the idea to?
About 2 years, I would say. Yeah.
And have you been surprised, intrigued by the public response?
Yeah, I'm very touched actually. I think it makes me slightly emotional for Lucrezia. I've always felt that she was overlooked and underloved, and the idea that people are looking at her picture and reading about her, I do find quite moving. I'm so glad she's out from behind the curtain now.
She's out behind the curtain there. Chloe Zhao is doing a movie of HAMNET. I'm sure that's going to be a huge sensation in Hollywood. There is a strong, it seemed to me from reading the book, there is a strongly cinematic quality to your writing and to the imagery. Have the movie rights been picked up yet?
Yes, they have. Yeah, nothing is sort of firmed up yet, but someone has the movie rights have been sold. So who knows?
Who's gonna play Lucrezia?
Oh, I don't know. That would be an exciting casting. I think somebody unknown would probably be best.